Be seated.
If you would join me again in Luke chapter 22. We've been spending our time here with Jesus at the Last Supper. It is a sad occasion indeed as you reflect on the events leading up to and surrounding the cross. There was complete failure on the part of all the people involved. As Jesus would say on this occasion, all of you will fall away because of me. I tried to think if there was any exception to that in the story, and honestly, the only thing I can think of is some of the ladies who were at the foot of the cross. Mary, the mother of Jesus, included in that number, who, as best I can tell, did not have any part in denying or leading to those things, other than the fact that Jesus died for all of us, and we're all guilty of sin, including Mary and the other women there. But all of his followers would at some point abandon him, and it's such a sad thing. But if there's a beauty in all the sadness, it's that the righteousness and faithfulness of Jesus shines all the brighter as those around him crumple under pressure and unfortunately, do not live up to their convictions. It shows how strong and faithful our Lord is and was through that trial and time in his hardest days. So tonight, or this morning, we'll join again then in that evening at the supper. And you'll recall in verse 20 that he had already announced to them that there was a betrayer sitting at the table with him. After taking the cup, he said, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." And almost without even skipping a beat, he goes on to say, "But behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." And they all began to question one another which of them it could be who was going to do this. This is a new revelation to them that even in that small number there gathered in the upper room, one of them was going to betray Jesus. We see back up in verses 3 through 6 that Judas, of course, is that betrayer, and he had already set that betrayal in motion. May have already been paid. It appears he was. He might have had the money with him. Who knows? But he had already determined to betray Jesus, and that really sets Judas's failure apart from the other failure of the other men, including Peter, which we're going to be focusing on this morning, in that Judas's was a predetermined, thought out plan to betray Jesus, and it involved deception. And he knew, even as Jesus is talking, what he had already determined to do and what he was going to do, and that sets his failure apart. And I think we see a difference in terms of how his failure turns out in the end, which we won't get to this morning. But it was a different level of a heart problem from the others, as we'll see. Even Peter, whose denial we're going to be looking at today. So verse 31, Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat." Just think of how the fear that, or just the thought of that. The only other occasion that we know of like this, of course, is Job. And the setup to Job is that there was a discussion in heaven, apparently, where it was, God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And the tempter says, "Well, yeah, but he hasn't really been tested." And that led to the whole setup of what happens with Job. And so I don't know the setup or the conversation or how it is that Satan demanded to have Peter, to have a shot at him. Might have been a similar conversation. We just don't know that part. In what way did Satan demand to have a chance to find out what Peter's made of? But he did. Jesus knows this, and Jesus is revealing this now, that Satan has demanded to have a chance to find out what Peter's made of. In fact, this idea of sifting, when you think of it, you take, well, there's different ways, but you could take some flour and you put it in a little strainer and you do like that, and it falls through the holes, and or some way you shake it out until you see what's left. And so it would be a way of finding out what you've got, when all the dust settles, kind of what's left over. So Satan wants to find out. He wants to take Peter and sift him and see what's in, what he's made of, where his convictions are. Will he stand the test? And Jesus says something probably even more disturbing in verse 32, but I have prayed for you, not that would be encouraging, but notice what he says. Why is he praying? That your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Well, that when you have turned again, I think the King James says repented, is implying that Jesus knows that Peter's going to have to recover from some failure. Satan's demanded to test you, and I've prayed for you. And when you have come back, when you have returned, when you have corrected yourself, help your brothers. Well, that implies that he's not going to pass this test with flying colors. And Peter, I think, knows that, because he replies to this in verse 33, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. He doesn't understand. He's ready to pay the highest price. He's ready to die. So he doesn't accept that what would he need to repent of? Why would he need to turn back? What is Jesus talking about? But Jesus says to him, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. Those must have been impossible to comprehend, those words. But Peter fully, I believe, would you not agree, that meant with complete conviction what he said, that he was ready to die for Jesus. And so the very thought that and it's already supper time, it's in the evening, and before the day dawns on the following day, he's going to deny that he knows Jesus. Must have been just completely incomprehensible to Peter. But we're going to follow the story and see how it is that this happened, and some lessons that we can learn from it. So John's account includes a few details that are not here in Luke's. So let's go over and just continue the story in John's account. John 18 is where that's located. We're going to pick up some details from John's account and Matthew's account as we go through this to see what happened. How did Peter go from being ready to die for the Lord to denying that he knows him? Let's follow along the story in John 18, beginning in verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, Whom do you seek? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to him, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, Whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost no one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Let's think about this sequence of events. First of all, we'll find out later in Luke, after today's passage, as we continue reading, that in their number they had 2 swords. Do you remember that? So on their side, Jesus and 11 apostles, Judas not being with them, and between their number they had 2 swords, and Peter's carrying one of them. And so Judas has procured some soldiers. He's secured a small army in a sense. He's got like an armed mob who's coming with him. And so these are professional people. They're outmanned and outnumbered, I think, in this case of this conflict. They've come out into the garden. So you've got Jesus and you've got these men. There's only 2 swords between them. I say all that to say, when Peter pulls that sword out, when he's watching all this go down, and he draws his weapon, do you think he was ready in that moment to die with Jesus if this was the time? I think he couldn't have been expecting that he and one other guy would be able to fight off all those men. I mean, but I think he was going to do his part. He was ready to do what he could in defense of Jesus. And he had said that, and I think he was living up to his words. If this is the hill that we die on, if this is where it all goes down tonight, and this is where it ends, he was ready to do what he could. And you can be sure, I'm sure he wasn't aiming for Malchus's ear when he swung his sword. And so this wasn't just some kind of like a parry or some kind of way to kind of try to scare him off. I mean, it was like he was ready for conflict. Of course, Jesus says in verse 11 to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And at this point, they all run away, as Jesus had said they would, except for two disciples. Skipping down to verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. It appears, most people would conclude this other disciple was John, who never names himself in his own gospel. And so it's often assumed that this other disciple who we don't, who's nameless here, was probably John. And so everybody, again, the 10, there was 11, they ran away. Peter and John follow the mob who's now arrested Jesus and bound him up. And they follow him. And as they all go down through the night, down the hill and into town, they come to the place where the high priest lived. And John, they recognize him. He just walks right in, but Peter's kind of stuck outside. So John comes out to make sure that he's allowed to come in as well. At this point, John kind of vanishes from the story. He's going to reappear at the foot of the cross. So I don't know where he was in the events that followed with the trial of Jesus and all those things, but we know that, again, there's this nameless disciple ends up there at the foot of the cross with the mother of Jesus in John's account. So the story now focuses on Peter and what goes down with him, but this brings us to his surprising denial after what had just happened in the garden. So let's go back to Luke's account to follow that. I like some of the details that John adds to the account there. Is why I wanted to kind of follow along through John's account. But picking up back in Luke 22, verse 54. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him to the high priest's house, and Peter was following at a distance. I think still, wouldn't you agree, trying to live up to his statement that he was ready to die or go to prison or whatever. And even if everybody else fell away, he was going to hang in there. He was going to stay with him. And when they had kindled a fire, verse 55, in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Notice whom Peter is among. It appears to be the same group that had arrested Jesus. Maybe in the cover of darkness, Peter assumed he would not be recognized. It appears that he thought he could maybe he's just going to observe at this point. He's got to be confused about what's going on. But he comes in and there's a group there. He's been let in the door. Now he's kind of in this courtyard with these people. Probably some of those people he's in the courtyard with were there at the garden when he had drawn his sword. But surely he was thinking they won't recognize him if he can just kind of sit there in the shade of the evening. But verse 56, a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." John tells us in his account that it was the same servant girl who had opened the gate. So she was the one that was there when John came and said, "He's all right, let him in." And then as he's sitting there and she's kind of looking at him in the flickering of the fire, she recognizes who he is. And at this very moment, Jesus is being interrogated, perhaps even mocked and beaten, because we know a little bit later he's going to turn and look at Peter. So within eyesight of probably where Peter was, but probably in a different area, things were happening to Jesus. Peter is there. He's now alone, except that he's in this crowd of people, probably the same people who had just arrested Jesus. And that's where this girl comes up and says, this guy was with him. Verse 57, but he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. Peter said, man, I am not. After an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean. In Matthew's account, we're told the bystander identified Peter by his accent, that the way he talked gave away that he was from Galilee. So just a reminder, Jerusalem and where all these events are taking place is in the south, in Judah. And then there was the area to the north end where the Samaritans lived, but farther beyond that to the north around the Sea of Galilee was Galilee. And the Jews from up there apparently talked a little differently. And you could recognize a northerner by their accent. So if you're down here in Jerusalem, you could kind of pick up on that. So something about the way Peter's talking, which also reveals that he was talking, which Peter's almost always talking, right? In any story about Peter, he's going to be saying something. And so he's there and talking, but his accent gives him away that he was from Galilee, which is unusual because probably everybody else there was from Judah. And they're saying, no, he's one of those guys. He's one of those Galileans who follows Jesus. Verse 60, Peter said, man, I do not know what you were talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crows. The other accounts add that he began to curse and swear. Apparently, the way this all plays out, Jesus was within view, at least at that moment, because in verse 61 it says, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said to him, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. He had failed the test. Satan had demanded to sift him like wheat, and Peter had given in. He denied even knowing Jesus, the one whom he had confessed to be the Christ, the Son of God, on an earlier occasion. So we'll stop at this point in the story to make some applications about this, some lessons. What can we learn from Peter's failure here? Let's go over to Matthew chapter. There's going to be 5 of these lessons, 5 little things to take away. Let's go over to Matthew's account in Matthew 26. The first lesson is do not trust in yourself. Do not trust in yourself. One of Peter's strengths was his boldness. He was usually the first to speak up. That same strength was also a weakness, as is usually the case. A strength in another setting can be our weakness. It turns out he was not as strong as he thought he was. In Matthew 26, beginning verse 30, when they sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. And Peter answered him, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus said to him, truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to them, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And to be fair, the verse completes and it finishes, and all the disciples said the same thing. So Peter was not the only one who made this declaration. None of them would accept that they were going to deny him. And so he's not the only one that said that he would not. I don't want to paint Peter in too harsh of a light here. But notice that Jesus had just said, and you would think Peter would learn by now, but Jesus had just said, you will all fall away because of me. And he had just quoted a prophecy that said this. And Peter, in direct contradiction of Jesus, says, no, I will not. even though Jesus had just said this. Now, you might recall on a previous occasion when Jesus said, the Son of Man is going up, as it's been written, he's going to be delivered over and crucified. Peter pulled him aside and said, Lord, this will not happen. Do you remember what Jesus said on that occasion? Get behind me, Satan. It was not right for Peter to directly contradict Jesus and say that what Jesus was saying was not going to come about. But not only that, Peter says, even if every one of those guys falls away, I will not fall away. Now, what was he putting his trust in? I believe he was putting his conviction and his trust in his own confidence in himself and what he thought he knew about himself. We could say this, sympathetically to him. He's probably meaning this in a good way. He's probably trying to say to Jesus, no, I'm not. I refuse to accept that I will deny you. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be with you, come what may. It's hard to fault him for saying that, except that Jesus had just declared what was going to happen. But this confidence in himself was doomed to fail. Let's look at another passage that goes along with this. I think 1 Corinthians 10. In 1 Corinthians 10, there's a lot of warnings here about not falling into the same trap that the people of Israel had fallen into time and time again. We read those stories from the Old Testament. We say, look at these people. They completely failed over and over and over. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul in his letter reminds them of several of those failures. And he says in verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Just as sure as we say to ourselves, I will never do this, I will never, if our trust is in ourselves, we're in danger of falling. As soon as we get cocky and think, I've got this, look out. We cannot trust ourselves. As Jesus says, the arm of flesh will fail you. Or as the song says, stand up for Jesus, the arm of flesh will fail you. You dare not trust your own. Pride causes us to think we're strong and we don't need help. And that makes us sitting ducks for the devil. Secondly, the second lesson is Satan wants us all. It's chilling that Jesus tells him Satan demanded to have you. But Peter and Job are not the only ones that Satan tempts. In fact, Peter himself, writing later in 1 Peter 5, says, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walks about as a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. That's 1 Peter 5:8. That's Peter writing that. Now, when you think about Peter writing that, do you suppose he reflected on any of the things that had happened to him? Even as Jesus had said, Satan demanded to have you to sift you like wheat. I mean, Peter could speak. Peter was writing those words as someone who had been tempted and had fallen. And he's telling his audience, be on the lookout, because it's not just me and it wasn't just Job, but Satan is walking about looking for someone to devour. And I think if we see that this happened to Peter, if we see this happen to Job, we should not expect that somehow we're going to be immune to that, or we're not going to be tested or tempted. So we need to be on the lookout, as Peter himself warns us. And that brings us to the third point, which is to watch your surroundings. If we're trying to figure out how did this all go down? In the garden, when Peter pulls his sword, there was this line of the conflict, right? See, the guys come with the pitchforks and the torches, and I don't know if they had pitchforks, but torches and swords. And then Peter is standing with Jesus and his disciples, right? And so in that moment, he's standing there with his crew. He's standing there with his guys. Two of them have swords, and those guys have swords, and they're coming head on. And I think every man wants to believe that you would do the right thing, that you would have the strength, probably every woman too. But it's sort of in us to say, yeah, if it comes down to it, what would happen? And you imagine all those scenarios that somebody says, what would you do if somebody threatens your life if you confess to believing in Jesus? Would you have the faith to die like those prophets of old? Would you have the faith to go into the fire furnace or to go into the battle? You want to believe you've got the strength to be like Peter and pull your sword. And it's a lot easier to be strong when you're surrounded with your spiritual family. It's a lot easier to be strong when you're standing with the Lord and you're standing with your brothers. But where does Satan get Peter? Actually, he doesn't get him there. It wasn't the soldiers with their swords. It was a servant girl. So how did he crumple it before a servant girl when he was not afraid to take a sword against armed guards? Well, one major thing that changed from one setting to the next is in the garden, Peter was isolated from his brothers. He was all by himself, and he was surrounded by people who were against Jesus. And he was sitting there by the fire, and it appears that he was talking. It seems to me that he had let his guard down. That is the case. So where we're most likely to be vulnerable is probably, the test might come in this form, but probably not. You're probably not going to be called on to, like, if you confess that you believe in Jesus, you better be ready to be thrown in jail or die right now. I mean, you kind of want to believe you'd pass that test, but the test is probably going to take a much subtler form of you'll just be somewhere around people you don't know or not with the people that you do know, and a question will come up, a comment will be made, and you'll have to decide then, are you going to stand by your convictions? Are you going to own up to Jesus and what he teaches, or are you going to try to avoid the pressure of the moment? That was the test that Peter actually failed, not the test in the garden. And that brings me to the fourth point. So watch your surroundings. Be aware of the people you're around. The fourth point is these little tests count just as much as what we think of as the big test, right? I mean, you might think, okay, I'm ready to lay down my life. I'm ready to face this. Of course, that's a dangerous thought anyway. That's point number one, right? But you want to believe that you're prepared for that moment. But it's the servant girl. Owning up to Jesus, to the servant girl, was just as important as standing up for Jesus before the mob. The small little tests that come our way, that give us a chance to stand by our convictions and choose the right path, say the right thing, around people that we might think are insignificant, or it doesn't really matter, or this isn't important. Those little tests where we have to choose to say what's right or say what's true are just as important as the big test. And then the fifth lesson I think we can take from this is that Jesus is on our side. I love that he tells Peter in this, before it all happens, I have prayed for you. Jesus is aware that Satan has demanded his shot at Peter. Jesus has been talking to his Father about it. And he is praying that Peter's faith will not fail. He knows how hard this is going to be on Peter because he knows what Peter's going to do. And he knows that it's going to crush him. And he knows that Peter's going to go out and weep bitterly. And he knows that it's going to be tough for Peter to recover from this failure. But so he's prayed for him. And he's pulling for Peter, that Peter, this will not throw him off track forever, but that he will be able to come back and take his place with the apostles, and he will be able to stand up in front of people and preach Jesus, that he would be restored, and that he would be an encouragement to others. And that's a wonderful thing. Jesus is our mediator. He's our high priest. He's our interceder. And he knows when we fail, and we fail, but he's pulling for us to come back and repent and take our place and carry on and serve him faithfully. And that's what he wants from each of us. And if we have turned away from him in some way, or if we have not had the faith to stand up as we should and do what we know we should do, Jesus, you should know this, is pulling for you to do the right thing and to recover from your failure. If there's someone here this morning who needs to make something right with the Lord, you have the comfort of knowing this same Lord there at his Father's side, and he is on our side, and he wants you to be restored. And if we can help in any way, let us know as we stand and sing.